So yesterday we focused on HTML and CSS. So today we're going to focus on JavaScript, but specifically JavaScript that runs in the browser. Client side, we refer to this, and we'll talk more about client versus server stuff shortly. But JavaScript running in the browser and specifically interacting with HTML elements. That's our focus for today. So you can include JavaScript right in your HTML file, but usually we write our JavaScript in a separate file and pull it into the HTML file, which is what we're going to do today. So here in our HTML index.html file, after the closing tag for the div, we are going to use the script tag and specify the source as scripts/main.js. So this is telling the web browser when it loads this HTML file, when it gets to here, it's going to go find main.js inside of the scripts folder, and it's going to execute that JavaScript as well. Okay. So this is how we pull JavaScript files into our HTML files. I'm 95% sure this needs to be toward the end of the HTML file and not at the beginning in this case, because this JavaScript code we're about to write together will reference elements up here. And I think they need to have already been encountered by the web browser. So pretty sure about that. All right, so let's take a look inside of our scripts folder. If we open that, here is main.js. There's not a lot in here right now, but we're going to write some code together. There is so much like JavaScript specific stuff you can do client side, you can do in the web browser. We're going to focus on like the bare minimum that we need to develop our web apps, right? And as I shared at the beginning when we started this, there's like 1,000 different ways to do web apps. I'm sharing with you one. And the one I'm sharing with you is relatively common and straightforward and doesn't require a lot of extra stuff. Okay. So just to like kind of let you know, there's a lot more that we could be doing here. One thing that's very common that we want to do in our JavaScript code running in the web browser is to get a reference to an element in the HTML document. Okay. And we do that with the query selector function returns the first element in the document that matches the specified selector. What I mean by selector, for example, is like the tag name, like H1. So here's an example. I can say const, this is still JavaScript. We're using all the JavaScript stuff we learned last week. Const my heading equals document is a, oops, if I spell it right, document. It's a global variable. It's accessible everywhere when the JavaScript code is running in the browser. It is a reference to the current HTML document. Okay, so this refers to the HTML document that we defined in index.html. So I can say document query selector, and then I can specify, give me a reference to the first H1 element in the HTML document. Yeah. Why? What? I'm sorry. Oh, around H1. The query selector takes a string as an argument, and so we need to put there like the name of the element without like the angle bracket tags. So if I wanted to find the first like paragraph element, I would use a P. If I wanted to find the first list item, I'd use like LI, stuff like that. Once we have a reference to an element in the document, we can do whatever we want with it in JavaScript. And this leads to some very powerful and flexible stuff with web pages. So JavaScript can modify an attribute of an HTML element. So I could say my heading dot text content is one of those attributes, and I can change it. I can change it to be like hello world. And if we look at index.html, here is the first header in our document with the text Mozilla is cool. What this means is when the web browser loads this web page and includes this JavaScript and starts running through this code, it's going to change that text to say hello world. This is just an example. It's not particularly useful. If we wanted it to say hello world, we just change it in index.html, right? But we could do this in response to like different user interactions, conditions, other things like that. So we can use the query selector method to select an element based on its like tag, right? Like H1. We can also do it based on its class. So let me show you that. This is much more common when we want to start adding event handling features to our web pages. So the query selector method can also be used to select an element by its class. What I mean by that is, for example, with the button here, this element is a button. It's, the tag is buttons of type button, but we also specified a class with a value of demo for this particular button. This allows us to handle some buttons different than other buttons. It doesn't have to just be a button. This is true of any element. So where this is useful is I could get a reference to a very specific button by saying document.querySelector, and then in quotes, I'd say button, that's the tag, and then I do a dot, and demo is the class. So it's tag.class is the selection format we use to target a specific class of elements. So this will return the first element in the document that is a button of class demo. Okay, so you can kind of see how these queries build. We do this a ton because the next step we want to do is we want to associate a function with this button if the user clicks on it, right? So we want our web pages to be interactive. All of our web apps by definition are interactive. And so therefore we need to do some event handling type stuff. The way we do that is we use the add event listener function, attaches, if I can spell it right, listener function, attaches an event handler. By event handler, I just mean another function, to the specified element associated with the specified event. I hope that this is a little bit familiar to you. If you think back to APCSA and you think back to some of the practice programming activities we did, like the triangle GUI or the different button clickers or the Tetris lab, all of those used like add listener methods on controls that called other methods in response. Conceptually, this is exactly the same thing, except now we're doing it with HTML controls elements in JavaScript. So we would say button.add event listener. Then in quotes, we specify the type of event we want to listen to. There are many different events. Today, we're only going to focus on the click event, meaning the event when the user clicks on the button with their mouse or trackpad or whatever. The second argument we pass is a reference to the function to call when the user clicks on the button. We will use the arrow function syntax for this. We're not going to write the function separately. This is much more common. So I have open and close parentheses. I have the arrow function operator. This is going to be multiple lines of code, so I'm going to open it with a curly bracket. And then we're going to type the code here that we want to do. Actually, it's not going to be multiple lines of code, but that's fine. Still, this works. We're just going to put up alert is a function we can call that pops up a dialog on the web page. Ouch, stop poking me. Okay, very important alert. As you might remember from APCSA, sometimes it's tricky just to get all the pieces right to make sure like you found the right element and you associated the right event with it and it's calling the right function. So throwing up an alert or doing a console.log here is not a bad approach to making sure things are working as expected. Let's try this out. So let's right click on index.html, say open with live server. Here's our page. Notice that it no longer says Mozilla is cool. It now says hello world. So that part is working. And if we scroll down to this button and click on it, it pops up the alert. Cool. We now have an interactive web page. So cool. We will be doing more stuff in our add event listener later in this unit. Okay, so like later next week when we start doing client server stuff in our actual node apps, we will implement our event listener functions to communicate with the server and send and get some data from the server in response to the user clicking on a button, for example. But for now, this is great. Let's do some other examples too, though. So let's see an example where we could do something more sophisticated. So let's add one more example. So client-side JavaScript code, or just JavaScript, can modify the attributes of HTML elements. So this is like, but the difference here from what we did before, but in response to events. So let's do something more sophisticated when the user clicks on the image of the Firefox logo. So we can say const my image equals document.query selector, return a reference to the first element that is of type image. And then we'll do add event listener, just like we did before. And we're still interested in the click event. So when they click on the image, run this function. We can get a reference to an attribute of the element. So I could say my source, meaning the source of the image, equals my image dot get attribute. Nope, not animation. Get attribute. I want the src attribute of the image. What that's going to return, just switching back here quick, here's the first and only image in our document. The value of the source attribute is images/firefox-icon.png. So we're going to get a reference to this attribute here in our code. And then we're going to look at it and toggle the image in response. So we can say if my source triple equals, we want to actually compare all the characters. If it is the Firefox icon.png, then we're going to say my image.set attribute. We're going to change the source attribute to be images/sc-github. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to look here. sc-github-image.png. So we're going to toggle it, switch it to be our software engineering GitHub image. Otherwise, I'm going to copy and paste because that's a lot. We're going to set it back to Firefox icon.png. So again, not super useful, but this is an example. We just made a simple toggle on the web page in JavaScript. So after you type this, reload the page in Chrome, click on the Firefox image, and it should toggle to be our GitHub image. And if you click on it again, it should toggle back to be the Firefox image. So not particularly useful, but an accessible example of how we can get references to elements, get references to their attributes, do some conditional logic, and then change those attributes in response.